And I just want to get these terminologies factually correct and out there, because I think there is a lot of confusion between what like the differences between maybe transgender, transsexual, and even non-binary. Can we just clarify some of these things just so that we can keep people on the same page there?
Yeah, so transsexual is a medical term. It was the more commonly used term historically. It's been deemed insensitive now by some people, but other people will still identify that way because there's an emphasis on medical transition in that definition. So someone is transitioning medically to the opposite sex. Transgender is the more recent, iteration of, I don't even want to say the word transsexual, but I will in this context, to say that it has more of a component in identity and how you feel to, I think, distance itself from the mandate of having undergoing some sort of medical aspect to it. And then does that make sense?
Yeah, right. Keep going.
And then non-binary is, I would say, purely self-identification and feelings. There's no medical diagnosis. So gender dysphoria is a medical diagnosis, I should clarify. So that is when someone feels more in alignment with the opposite sex than their birth sex. So there's a very large body of research documenting this as a legitimate condition. Non-binary people do not experience gender dysphoria. Some of them may, but the fact that there's no clear scientific evidence for this idea of gender not being binary, that's where I'm skeptical. I have no issue using the pronoun someone wants me to use, being respectful in that way, and I think you can identify however you want. But my issue is when people start bending what science says to facilitate whatever it is they want to achieve socially.
Yeah, the non-binary one seems to be confusing for me personally. So trans is basically when you identify or you express yourself as the opposite sex that you were born into per se. So you are acknowledging that there are as a male and female, whereas a non-binary person thinks there's a third or fourth or fifth gender, whatever it might be, just an anonymous gender that, and they don't identify themselves either as male or female. Is that correct?
Right. And so what we're seeing, as I was saying earlier, is that non-binary people are lumping themselves in as transgender now, because I think what they want is the legitimacy of what the transgender community has attained for itself. And the other difference I would emphasize is between gender dysphoria and identifying as transgender, because in many cases you'll hear people talking about transgender children. And I really don't like that. And I talk in the book about why, because gender dysphoria is an actual medical condition, whereas transgender is more of an identity label, it's a political label in some cases. And children don't have the capacity to decide if they want to be part of a political movement. But what you'll see is adults will refer to these kids as transgender kids because it adds to, I think, the legitimacy of whatever political agenda they're trying to push.
Gotcha. And what percentage of the population are we talking about for people that are transgender and then also people that are non-binary? So
in the American adult population, about 6 in 1,000 people are transgender.
6 in 1,000, okay.
And then with non-binary, 10% of millennials. That's been the latest statistic. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people.
10% of millennials are non-binary. Okay. Huh.
And we can talk about what I actually think it's about. I think it has to do with a lot of other things that may not even really have to do with gender. Because some people might say they experience gender dysphoria. You also have some people who are transitioning and they will say they don't have gender dysphoria. They're transitioning just because they want to live as the opposite sex, because in many cases you'll have someone who's born female who says they'd rather live as a man because life is easier living as a man. So they will say, I don't have gender dysphoria.
But a non-binary person, there's no gender dysphoria there, right? Because they're not choosing that they feel one opposite sex or the other. They're just saying there is no gender they feel.
My sense is, because there actually isn't very much research, there's certainly not objective research about this movement because it's considered hateful to question it. By me saying that non-binary is not a thing, that's considered hateful. So I do think for some people, they legitimately are suffering. They are legitimately experiencing distress and they're trying to understand themselves. But I feel there's a large contingent also of people who are just using this label as a way to get social accolades, to signal their politics, to show
They're
how
woke.
Yeah, their wokeness, their progressiveness. And I think in many cases too, it depends on the person. I mean, if someone is a public figure and they identify as non-binary, I think a lot of that is about just getting more attention to your brand. If it's someone who, like in many cases, I think it is young gay people who are not necessarily comfortable with being gay. So if they identify as a different gender, that allows them to avoid having to deal with people who are anti-gay. In many cases, it's also young women who just don't want to be female because they experience sexism, say, in everyday life. And they think, well, if I'm not a woman, I don't have to deal with this.